Hey there, it's Lars. Thanks for checking out the Lars Larson podcasting experience, and have a fantastic day.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls and emails. I want to tell you something. I speak out against teachers' unions all the time, and I know that sometimes classroom teachers take that personally. Well, you should only take it personally if you have the attitude you belong to the union and the union tells you what to do. Now, as I always understood it, unions are groups of workers, typically, and the workers have a right to tell the union, this is how we want you to represent us, not the other way around. Now, I realize there are some union members who simply say, well, the union told me I had to do it, so I had to do it. You're forgetting they represent you, not the other way around. So what happens when an entire teachers union decides to hold a state hostage in order to keep families away from school choice? I want to tell you what happened. It just happened yesterday, and it is a tremendous deficit to every kid, to every family, to every parent out there. But let me get to the details in a moment. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. In Pennsylvania, something extraordinary was going to happen. And that is, the state of Pennsylvania was about to become, yesterday, the 8th state in America that has offered up school choice to the citizens of the state. And what I mean by that is there are a number of states that have already done it. Arizona did it last year. What they said was, if you're unhappy with the public schools, and I think there are good reasons to be unhappy with the public schools, they fail far too many students. They produce students who can't read, who can't write, who don't know much, and yet they still get a graduation certificate. And of course, the union members all get paid. So everybody's happy, right? No, they're not happy. The parents say, this is a bad result. We could do better if you give us not all the money that you're spending on my child, but just a portion of that money. Now, see, I don't have a direct dog in the fight because I went to public school. Tina went to public school. Our adult kids, my stepkids, went to public school. But if your kids are in school right now and you say, well, what are my alternatives? Right now, you really don't have any. The government-run schools say, we're going to take your tax money. You can send your kids to us, and we have no other options for you whatsoever. What school choice is about is saying, I would like some of the money that you're spending on my child, give it to me in the form of an education voucher. They don't just give you cash. And I'll go out and I'll find a charter school, a private school, a parochial school, an online school. Whatever works best for my child, I should be able to make that choice. And I made the argument that with virtually every other government program that exists to help people out or to take care of a need, while some of those programs I could argue about whether or not they should be run the way they are, the way they're run right now, you can spend those dollars anywhere you want. If you get a Pell Grant for college, they don't tell you you can only go to a government university. You can take your Pell Grant to a private university. If you get food stamps, they don't say, but you can only spend these food stamps to buy food at a government grocery store. If you get Medicaid or Medicare, they don't say you must go to the county hospital or a hospital run by a state government. They let you spend those Medicare and Medicaid dollars at any medical institution in your state, even outside of your state. You could go right down a long list. Section 8, most Section 8 housing is private housing, but the Section 8 money comes from the government. Now, does the government say you can only spend this Section 8 money to buy or to rent housing that is provided by the government? They don't. So if it works for all those other things, shouldn't it work for education? Here are the dollars. And I think it'd stun you how much America spends on public education. Nationwide, it's around $15,000 per child per year. $15,000 per child per year. And you say, well, are they getting a good job done for that much money? And the answer is generally no. So 7 states have already said, we will give parents a portion. In the case of Arizona, I think it's $8,000 a year. And most of the parents will tell you, for $8,000, I can go and put my kid in a really top-notch private school. Now, if you want one of the elite schools, what's it called? There's one back in D.C. that all the presidents and the members of Congress send their kids to. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just a really good private school can be had for a portion of the money that is spent to put your kids in government schools, K through 12, the local neighborhood school. So 7 states have already done this, and there's a tidal wave coming right now. Because of the pandemic, because of the way the teachers' unions acted during the pandemic, when they said, our members still want to get their paychecks, but they don't want to go back to the classroom, a lot of parents said, then I'm taking my kid out of the schools. Millions of kids in the last 2 years have been removed from the public schools. But those parents should have a way to use some of those tax dollars that are provided for public K through 12 education. So along comes Pennsylvania. And the governor of that state is a Democrat, Josh Shapiro, and he had made it a campaign promise. And it was an unusual one coming from a Democrat because usually Democrats don't do anything that runs sideways to the unions because the unions are one of the best gifts the Democrat Party has ever had. They give a lot of money. They will say our members will vote for you. But Josh Shapiro won as governor of Pennsylvania. But one of his promises was, I'm going to provide school choice. That ended about 24 hours ago. Because right up to the last minute, Josh Shapiro said he was going to fulfill his promise. He was going to take $100 million of public money and provide it in something called the PASS, the PASS. It was an acronym for a program that would provide you with tax credits or vouchers or both so that you could pull your kids out of conventional public schools, failing public schools, and get the education that you wanted. It even gave parents the opportunity to have even a bigger dog in the fight. Because a parent could take, say, in Arizona, the $8,000 they were getting from the school system in a school voucher and add $2,000 or $3,000 to it and put their kid in whatever kind of education they want to purchase with that amount of money. Made total sense. So what happened? The Pennsylvania Democrats, they actually said, we're not going to let the entire state budget, $45.5 billion, pass unless you kill this little program. $100 million out of $45 billion, but they were going to kill the entire state budget. They were in a 5-day impasse where neither side would give in. And finally, at the end of it, Josh Shapiro, Democrat governor, you should take this into account if you believe the promises of Democrats. He had promised that he would make sure to deliver on school vouchers and school choice for parents. He caved in to the labor unions, the teachers union in particular. He caved in to his fellow Democrats, and he agreed. He said, okay, I'll go ahead. I'll kill the program. I'll put a line item veto right through that thing. I will kill it. The parents won't get it. The kids won't get it. School choice will not happen because making sure the state government had money to operate on was more important than actually delivering for parents and students and ultimately a better job for teachers, too. Glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to take your phone calls and your emails at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. I got to tell you something. I use the term woke because I call it a term of art. It's come to mean something today that perhaps if you'd used the word a decade ago or even half a decade ago, people wouldn't have taken the same meaning from it. Peter Zane has written about it as a columnist for Real Clear Politics, and we always like having him come on the program. Peter, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
What do you mean? What do people mean by woke? And I've got my own, I think, working definition that works, but what is it that people are getting excited about that woke has been hijacked by the right? I guess that would include me.
Well, I wrote a column about it because it's been in the news recently when there was a conservative woman who's written a book about woke, and so she clearly knows how to define the term, but she was asked to define it, and she stumbled a little bit. And so the woke people did two things that are very telling. The first thing is that they had collective guilt. So they said that she could not define the term then, so therefore nobody can. And then they pretended that no meaning actually exists of a word that we use all the time. And so I started to think about what does woke mean and how do I use it, and what is the essence of it? And I think that the essence of woke is that it is the ongoing cultural revolution and the effort by the left to command language and perception to define reality in any way that's useful to their aims. And I think that's the fundamental thing that brings all of it together, is we are going to tell you what reality is, and reality is whatever we find it useful to be.
I mean, because I guess when we go back to what racism is, and then you've got somebody who says, but I'm not racist, and then you have people, a whole crowd of people today saying, but it's not enough to just not be racist. That is, not use somebody's skin color to determine how you're going to treat them or make the way you're going to interact with them. So if somebody pulls up to a gas station and a man comes out to pump his gas who happens to be a black man, and he says, no, I don't want you pumping my gas. I want that guy over there, the white guy. I would say, okay, that seems pretty blatantly racist. But these days, it's not enough to just be colorblind, to say, I don't care what color our waitress is, or the guy who pumps the gas, or the guy who's running my bank loan at the bank. I don't care what color he is. It makes no difference. That's not enough. To be woke, you have to be actively anti-racist. Is that a piece of it?
I certainly think that's a piece of it, but what I was trying to get at in my column is, because one of the things, even thoughtful conservatives have sort of tried to define it as, well, a belief that America has a long history of oppression and repression that continues, and woke people feel that it's systemic and it's in our DNA and difficult to overcome, but we have to work towards it. I think that their central impulse is to problematize all of the existing structures of society, and that's marriage, that's capitalism, that's your faith, whatever it is, to point out problems in it. And I don't know what they're trying to replace it with. So that's the first thing, is they constantly are trying to problematize things. And then I think that the umbrella is not, geez, how do you feel about black people or affirmative action or whatever? It's, I'm going to tell you that the BLM riots were mostly peaceful. And it doesn't matter that you saw lots of rioting. That doesn't, and it's the insistence on telling us things that are obviously false. And that's with COVID, that's with trans stuff. There's a million things that, and I think that's the central element of it, is to impose a view of reality. And then what you see is when people are like, they push back, then the coercion starts, then the illiberalism starts, then the demonization starts. And I think that this little episode here where they go, woke isn't even a word, it doesn't mean anything. Well, we all know what it is. We roughly know what it is, just like we know what justice is, we know what fairness is. We can argue about that objectivity. What is objectivity? There's not one definition that 100% of people agree on, but we are all swimming in the same water, but that's inconvenient to them. So they have to gaslight you and say, it's not even a word.
Yeah, because then they take away that word by saying that word is now what, forbidden to be used by you because you don't know what it means? Is that what they're trying to do?
Even though it was actually developed by African Americans, and in a weird way, it has a long tradition even before African Americans.
What, 90 years or so? Is 90 years a fair timeline for that, Peter?
For which one? I'm sorry.
For woke.
I think it can be traced back in terms of African Americans to the 30s, but I mean, honestly, George Whitefield in the First Great Awakening in the 18th century, I mean, there's this idea of like being aware of what you can't see, being awakened to the truth. And that's what they have, sort of taken it in that American tradition, but they've married it to, this absolute, coercive language that denies reality. And that's why you see even, Joe Biden, when he says, our pull out of Afghanistan was perfect. And people are like, well, clearly it wasn't, and we left billions of dollars of equipment. You don't think of that as being woke, but it is, because It is the central element of we are going to tell you what reality is, and you are going to submit. And if you don't, we're going to call you names. We're going to cancel you.
Well,
That
we're going to
is the
suggest that
essence
you are unwoke, and unwoke is a crime. I mean, for example, I guess what it reminds me of, Peter, is the term of art, fruit of the poisonous tree. It usually applies in law enforcement, where if a bad search was done, a search that violated somebody's constitutional rights, everything that comes out of that is flawed and forbidden. It's forbidden to be used in court. So if you can say America is fatally flawed because of its origins, not in 1776, but in 1619, then everything that came out of that, everything that exists around you, every structure, every person, every institution, they are also fatally flawed. And by defining it that way, you can then say, and now because all these things around us are flawed, every element of government, every element of business, then therefore you're not entitled to enjoy any of the benefits from any of those institutions, including capitalism, the republic we live in, the system of voting. All of that is forbidden because it's all fatally flawed as fruit of the poisonous tree.
Exactly. And I think that, again, the other key point of this, and I think it is command of reality and language, but is the problematizing. Because you say to yourself, well, what do they want to replace it with? They don't know. There's no, you can't find one of these left-wing people, they could talk in the most general, bizarre terms, that are completely incoherent, by the way. Just a fairer society or whatever. But, what exactly are we going to be a nation built around? What's going to pull us together as a people? What kind of economic system are we going to have that can afford to produce enough wealth to take care of people? They don't think, if we don't like the family, what are we going to replace it with? And I would point out to you that they have pretty much controlled the schools and the culture for the last 30 years. And we have an epidemic of anxiety, depression, suicide among our youth. That is just, and they never take a step back and say, geez, we're doing all this, and what are we getting?
And by the way, I'm talking to Peter Zane, who's a columnist at Real Clear Politics. Peter, I think they plan to replace it with government. I just did a whole segment on the fact that the schools are now openly saying, you parents have no right to say to us, you can't teach my kid that. So the schools replace the parents. Well, who's going to feed the kids? That'd be the schools. And who's going to feed people? Well, that would be the government. Food stamps, welfare, TANF, whatever, guaranteed monthly income or universal basic income. Who's going to take care of the medical? That'll be the government as well. Peter Zane's columns can be found at Real Clear Politics.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Come back to the Lars Larson Show. I have a lot of respect for our neighbor to the north, and that is Canada. But I always like to remind people that Canadians are still subjects, whereas Americans are still citizens, at least for now, which is a good thing to remind yourself of when you hear about crazy ideas like this. A bill in Canada that would empower the Attorney General of Ontario to establish 100-meter, meaning roughly 300-foot safety zones around drag shows and other LGBTQ events in the province of Ontario that would make harassment, intimidation, and offensive remarks, however you want to define that, punishable by fines of up to $25,000. And if you say, well, you can't do that, that's free speech. Just remember, our Canadian subject friends do not have free speech protected in the Constitution as we do. Now, I know the guy who knows that well is Terry Schilling, the president of the American Principles Project. Terry, welcome back to the program. And tell me what's going on in Ontario that would make them say we're going to set up safety zones around drag shows.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Lars. I love coming on. Essentially, before I get into what they're doing, it's important. I know this is Canada, but it's important to pay attention to what Canada is doing because in a lot of ways they are ahead of the curve for where America is heading on all these LGBT issues. So essentially what they're doing is they're criminalizing any dissent around the transgender or LGBT issue. And I don't know if you noticed from the press conference, they have little signs now that it's not LGBT anymore, it's 2S LGBTQIA++++. And what's important is that this is essentially now a categorizing of people with various mental illnesses. That 2S, that stands for two-spirit. And I don't want to dwell on that too much, but these are people
I don't even, I'll admit, Terry, I don't even fully understand what two-spirit is. I get the idea of the rest of it, I think. But what is two-spirit?
It's essentially, it's sometimes you're one person and another time you're a totally other person. It sounds like a multiple personality disorder, and if we were a sane country, that's what we would call it, is multiple personality disorder. But we've moved away from calling all of these issues disorders, right? Everything in the LGBT alphabet used to be categorized as a disorder, but now we're categorizing it as a normal experience, just differently ordered. We're going from disordered to differently ordered, to where it's not actually a problem. We're the problem for thinking it's a problem.
No, and you're right. I think all of this, the business about transgender, or if it really is a claim that you're a dysphoria case, that's a mental illness. And two-spirit definitely sounds like multiple personality disorder. But we've now said, if you have this mental illness, then you get additional protections. And by the way, what I said about Canada, I don't mean that their crazy ideas won't come down here. There have certainly been lots of crazy ideas that are anti-First Amendment, anti-free speech, petitioning your government for redress of grievances. That whole misinformation campaign that Biden abortively tried to launch, with the Ministry of Truth, as we called it, that was all in violation of the Constitution. And it was exactly the kind of thing you probably could get away with automatically in Canada, but thank God we have the Bill of Rights.
No, that's exactly right. But what's essentially happening, Lars, is the left wing, the sexual left here, understands how weak and vulnerable their movement is. They're seeing what's happening across America. We're up to 20 states now that have banned transgender sports. We're up to 14 states that have banned surgeries and on hormone treatments for minors in terms of transgenderism. What they're seeing is that the American people and politically are pushing back against their profits. So this is a transgender industry. It's $2.1 billion right now, and that's just in America, and that's just pertaining to the surgeries. So it's much bigger than what we realize. Essentially, they're criminalizing our ability to stop them from making profits. That's what's on the line here, and that's what makes us different than everything else.
Well, and Terry, by the way, when people have said to me, well, are you opposed to adults making this? I said, I'm in favor of letting an adult do pretty much what they want. So, but then again, when it comes to doctors, if you say, should it be legal for a doctor to take a perfectly healthy individual and cut her breasts off to make her more like a man? I would say no. And doctors are licensed by the state and by the federal government, and they usually need both licenses to be able to practice. And say that's where the stopping point is. Do whatever you want, wear whatever kind of underwear you want, wear whatever kind of clothing you want, behave or makeup, behave any way you want. But when you say we would like a state and federal licensed doctor to start cutting body parts off perfectly healthy individuals, I'd say, no, I'm not in favor of that. And I would hope that legislatures and the Congress would back that up.
No, that's exactly right. So most of the debate right now has been around protecting children. But in reality, we also need to protect adults eventually. Now, I don't know what that looks like. I think most likely the best scenario is to open up the liability protections for these patients and allow them to sue for malpractice once they end up coming to the conclusion that they were taken advantage of and exploited, and that they actually didn't change their sex, even against all of the promises that they were falsely promised by these medical quote unquote professionals. But yeah, it's absolutely absurd. It's all built on lie after lie after lie. The first obviously being that men can become women and women can become men, or that men and women don't even exist, that you could be non-binary. I mean, this whole movement is just built on lies, and it's creating chaos, destruction, and I would say even before the Nashville shooting, it was creating death. Right? These are unhappy people. They're being lied to and affirmed in their mental illness, and it's just making things worse.
Well, I realize I'm not stating it in psychiatric or psychological terms, but that's the key of it, isn't it? If you say, I'm unhappy in my own skin, and you say, okay, you're unhappy, what would you like us to do? Cut some parts off, give me some chemicals, let me do some things to my body. And when those people, especially in Great Britain, which seems to track a little ahead of us on some of these social issues, ahead not in a good way, but in a bad way, they've already realized this stuff is bad news. And an awful lot of the people who had these things done to them are still unhappy, and they haven't solved their problems. And now they want to be changed back. And you say, hold on, in some cases, we aren't going to be able to fully change you back. And then who's going to take the blame for it? The minute your state legislature or the Congress says you have to let people do this, and in fact, we'll even participate with taxpayer dollars, then if you've done something to a person that they decide down the road was a bad thing and they want it undone, you know who's going to be on the hook for it? The folks who signed off on it legally and the folks who signed off on taxpayer money going into it.
No, that's exactly right. And you're bringing up a very important point, which is that this all exploded when the government got involved. When Barack Obama and his administration declared with an executive order that gender identity disorder was unlawful under Obamacare, what it did was it forced insurance companies and taxpayers to cover and pay for these surgeries and hormone treatments. People weren't getting the sex changes or the mastectomies when it cost them $40,000 out of pocket. But now that their insurance premiums that you and I and everyone else in America are paying for are actually the things covering it, now a ton of people are getting it. And now that's the difference between the UK and us is the UK doesn't have profits in their healthcare system. So the best research and the best findings are actually, ironically, going to come from Europe because there's no profit incentive. There's no companies out there producing propaganda and fake research and reports to protect their dangerous and fake industry that's exploiting vulnerable people.
Absolutely right. Terry, I've got a break. I'm up against the break, but that's Terry Schilling from the American Principles Project. Terry, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. We'll get to your calls in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Glad you're listening on The Lars Larson Show, and glad to get your phone calls, too, at 866-HEY-LARS. Send emails to talk@larslarson.com. Our Twitter poll today, should schools require teachers to lie to parents about a student's gender transition? Now, of course, my answer to that is no. The liberals and a lot of the school districts are requiring teachers to lie to parents, to even deceive and mislead parents about their students' gender transition, which is if they're deciding to do that kind of thing. If they're taking puberty blockers, chemical castration, double mastectomy for girls, I'd say that's a fairly significant thing in a young person's life. And if leading the parents astray is now the job that schools are assigning to teachers to lie to the parents, then I think you should pull your kids out of public schools right now, put them in private school, home school, tutoring, online, charter, whatever works. Those places are dangerous to your kids. Today's Twitter poll can be found at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by Ultimate Truck Services. If you rely on trucks for business, Ultimate keeps your biggest assets on the road and running right. Find them at ultimatetruckservice.com. And since I've tried as much as I can, whenever there is an opportunity to say this is wrong, the schools are doing it wrong, and if you say to yourself, well, Lars, what do you suggest we do about it? Number one, get your kids out as fast as possible. And as an alternative, if you cannot do that, go to the next school board meeting and say, I demand to know, are teachers being told to lie to parents about something as significant as a child who is confused about gender and plans to transition, maybe even seek state paid for and state assisted gender transition, meaning mutilation of that child? Demand to know, are you telling teachers to lie to the parents? And if the answer is not either no, it can't be I don't know, it can't be yes, you've got to demand that of school boards and make sure you record what they say and what you ask on video. 2, now I want to have Pam Lewison join us, who's director of the Washington Policy Center's Initiative on Agriculture, for an entirely different subject. Pam, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me today.
I have to tell you, I'm not a big fan of wolves. I'm not a big fan of the government bringing them back to the Pacific Northwest, especially since the wolves they've now reintroduced in both Oregon and Washington are not genetically the same wolves. They're bigger. They're perhaps more dangerous. We predicted years ago when they began to do this, they would become a problem. not so much for human beings, although there is a threat there, but for ranchers and farmers, they'd be a giant problem. So there's a possibility of getting the gray wolves delisted, isn't there?
I hope so. So my coworker Todd Myers and I wrote a little piece about trying to get wolves delisted in the easternmost third of Washington state. They are already federally delisted in that area, but the state maintains an ESA listing for them. If you look at just base numbers, they have reached a population where we consider them recovered based on numbers alone. And interestingly, so do the Confederated Colville tribes, as well as the other tribal communities that are in that sort of eastern third region of the state.
Yep.
So what we're asking for really is just parity with what the federal government is already saying, specifically so that it can provide some relief and potentially some protection measures for ranchers in that area.
Pam, let me ask you this. Not all the audience, I know, but not all the audience knows what the significance is of an animal being listed under the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, and what delisting would make possible. So please bring them up to date.
Sure. Any protected animal under the ESA, whether it's state or federal, killing that animal is a crime, and it comes with a pretty hefty fine and the potential for jail time as well. So delisting gives ranchers who, in particular, have livestock under attack from what are apex predators, the ability to protect their animals by shooting those wolves without fear of any kind of recrimination or potential punishment. Currently, if a wolf is, quote, caught in the act, meaning a rancher or their range rider sees a wolf actively eating a cow or a sheep, they have the ability to kill them now. However, caught in the act is really hard to do because wolves are naturally skittish. So what we have instead are a lot of dead sheep and dead cows, and wolves that are going to continue to habituate to do that without having some sort of deterrent beyond what's already existent. So
and by the way,
the
in the piece you and Todd wrote, you point out there are now 216 wolves and 19 breeding pairs. But if I remember Idaho's history correctly, they didn't put out tags and start to take down these animals till there were well over 1,000 in a state the size of Idaho. Washington could be in the same boat, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I think, when we say that 216 wolves and 19 breeding pairs, what we really mean is that's the bare minimum. That's what the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife has been able to count. Certainly, you could argue, and I think everyone should, that there are significantly more wolves that have not been counted or tagged.
And I think I've been in the outdoors a lot over the last 20 years. I've seen one cougar in the wild. I've seen no wolves with my own eyes. I've seen videos, but my argument would be this kind of apex predator threat to livestock as well as potentially to humans. And you say, well, what's the benefit of them being there? They've been gone or were gone for about 70 years or more. And I've asked wildlife folks, so what's the benefit of having them there? They say, well, people want to see them. I said, how many people have you talked to who have actually laid eyes on a wolf? And they'll say, well, almost nobody. You say, so it's like having something in the woods that's there so people can see it, but nobody ever sees it, or people very rarely see them. I don't see the benefit, frankly.
I think the argument that some wildlife folks will make is that they hope that they will cull out ailing ungulates, so elk and deer that maybe are malnourished. Those are the animals that they're hoping they will target in their eating behaviors. But we don't necessarily see that. What we see is that because they're an apex predator and one that is an advantageous hunter, if the meat that's available is a cow or a sheep, that's what they're going to have. They're not
Absolutely right. Pam Lewison is director of the Washington Policy Center Initiative on Agriculture. Pam, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. Glad to get your phone calls and your emails at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I've told you a few times I had two parents in the military. Mom was Lieutenant J.G. Harriet Larson, and my dad was in the United States Navy, came out as a chief petty officer. He was in for about 21. She was in for 5. So I admire that. And anybody who's had a parent in the military knows that you're fascinated by the stories when those vets are willing to tell their stories. So I wanted to talk to Charles Stanley, author of a brand new book called Lost Airmen, The Epic Rescue of World War II U.S. Bomber Crews Stranded Behind Enemy Lines. Mr. Stanley, welcome to the program.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
What happened to your father and 18 of his fellow service members?
Well, he was shot down, or I should say shot up over Germany and bailed out over Yugoslavia.
Wow. They managed to get to Yugoslavia. Was that friendly territory at that point or not?
It was Nazi occupied in the cities, but they couldn't control the countryside. So the underground managed to get a hold of them and bring them to a secure area called Sanski Most.
Now, did they bail out of that bomber, or did they ride the bomber down? How did it work? Because they had parachutes, right?
Yeah, they bailed out. The book's about 13 crews. My father's crew is one of them, and yeah, most of them bailed out. Only one of those crews crash landed.
And how did they manage? How long were they stuck behind enemy lines then?
Well, it varied according to their departure date, but they were the ones who were there the longest were there for a good 2 months.
2 months, and they managed to stay hidden, managed to stay fed, and managed to stay safe during all that time.
Yeah, it wasn't easy because this is a war-torn country, and the underground protected them, but the people themselves didn't have a lot of resources. They, this is a country that was as devastated by war as any in World War II.
So tell me this, did your dad talk about these stories? Did he tell you these stories?
Well, he wasn't much of a talker, but finally when he was getting older, we started looking into his story, and it was only then that we realized what a terrific story it was. And I didn't intend to write a book about it. It was only when I sort of dug into it a little bit, I realized that nobody had written about the experience of airmen being shot down in Yugoslavia before. And I decided that somebody ought to, so I did.
Well, you're a lucky guy because, Charles, my dad's gone, and my mom's gone as well. My mom was gone 50 years ago. My dad more recently, but not very recently. But the only time my dad never really told stories either. And I kind of regret, even in those days where I would have been, say, recording it on tape, which almost sounds antiquated by today. But I did have one experience because he had come to live with my wife and I for a time, and the internet was relatively new. It was at least new to him. I used it every day, but it was in the late 90s. Yeah. So the internet, the modern internet kind of began in 95 with Netscape. And he said, "What is this internet thing?" And I said, "Well, I'll show you." So we sat down in front of a desktop computer, big clunky thing in the late 90s. And I said, "What was the name of the sub you were on?" Because he was on a flat top for a while. He was a corpsman, right? He was medical corpsman, chief petty officer. And he was a pharmacist mate. He's basically, I think, he was a hard hat diver for a while. He did a bunch of stuff. And
wow.
and he gave me the name of the sub. And I said, "Well, let's see what happens." I had no idea. And again, the internet wasn't as comprehensive as it is now. I plugged in the name of the sub. I put U.S. Navy submarine and the name. There were like 12 sites that were all maintained by different people who were associated with, and there were pictures. And one of the stories they had on there, because he had told me the story. He said, "Yeah, one time, not the plane that George Herbert Walker Bush was flying, but the PBY They had PBYs out there, and occasionally they'd go in the drink, and they had to worry about sharks and killer whales and all kinds of things. So he said, we fished this guy out of the drink and, got him all fixed up and then delivered him back, got him back to land. But he told me that the story was there on the site. But that was one of the few that I remember from him because he, like your dad, just wasn't a big talker.
No, and actually, I interviewed 40 of these guys, and that was the case with most of them. They didn't talk till they got to about 65 when they decided that they'd better tell their story now, and I think after some of the trauma had worn off.
Tell me this: what was the most striking story of those you collected for the book called Lost Airmen?
Well, I'll say probably the most dramatic was John Wolf's story. John Wolf was a pilot who, like my father, was shot up over Germany, got to Yugoslavia, and typically what each pilot did was order their crew to lighten the ship so they could get further closer to the Adriatic coast so that they could be rescued. And so he ordered his men to throw out all the guns and ammunition in the back of the plane, and it got so low that he suddenly realized we're getting too low to bail out, and he rang the bailout buzzer. Most of the crew left, but 3 of them were left behind, and by the time he realized that they were too low to bail out, and he crash landed that plane into the side of a mountain, and in an effort to save them, and only one of them survived. So Wolf himself sacrificed himself for those men. Wow.
I mean, because that's quite a decision to have to make, that if you get so consumed with trying to deal with keeping the plane in the air and then you realize, because even in modern times, I think you need usually at least, 1,500 feet, maybe 2,000 feet to have a parachute operate?
You would like to have a good 1,000 feet at least. Actually, my father bailed out twice. The first time he bailed out from 300 feet.
Oh, no.
And without a scratch.
Really? Because
really?
people I've done a couple of tandem jumps, but and I thought it was a lot of fun. But you have to have time for that chute to inflate fully, from the air.
Yes,
and if you don't, you're still going too fast when you get to the ground.
He pulled the cord while he was in the bomb bay, jumping, knowing how close it was to the ground. Yes, that's not a bad story either. In the early part of the book.
No, absolutely right. Mr. Stanley, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. And we so appreciate the sacrifice of people like your father and those World War II bomber crews. The book is called Lost Airmen, the epic rescue of World War II U.S. bomber crews stranded behind enemy lines. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'll be glad to get your calls in a moment at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find the daily question at Lars Larson Show. And tell Alexa to play the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. I can't help but thinking that we had about half a century of Cold War, mostly with the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore, and we won without firing a shot. And now we appear to be in a Cold War of a different kind with China, and we've got Joe Biden as our commander-in-chief. What could possibly go wrong? On that note, it's a pleasure to welcome back to the program Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, who's an expert in national security and foreign policy challenges with the Heritage Foundation. Colonel, good to have you.
Yeah, so first of all, it's important. It's a new Cold War. The Cold War was not the first Cold War. There have been lots of Cold Wars in human history. Basically, it's when two sides side off against each other, and they do everything short of getting into a shooting war. We just came out with a big, and I call it a plan because it's not a report, it's not a strategy. It's here's the to-do list, right? And the argument it makes is it's a new Cold War, it's different. What we need to do to win, and we need to get serious about it.
Now, can you give us a sketch of it and then tell my audience where to find it if they want to read the whole thing?
Yeah, well, it's got like 100 different individual components to it. And what I did is I took some of the best experts in the country on this issue, on strategy, all the things related to it. And I said, okay, politics aside, and they're our enemy, okay? Get that? And we need to win. Tell me what we need to do. And we argued it out, and we came up with like 100 different things. So it's on the website, heritage.org, or you could just type in China, New Cold War, Heritage Foundation. It'll, I'm sure, pop right up. I think that what's big, the big things for me are, it's not just about protecting the United States, like banning TikTok, no Chinese land sale, kicking out Chinese students. We have to go on offense as well. We have to do things to China to diminish their capacity to come after us. So what I call is an offense-defense mix. And the other thing is, it's not just, well, the yahoos in Congress need to do this or Biden needs to do this. There's stuff in there that state and local governments need to do, the private sector, corporate boards, state and local governments, non-governmental organizations, our friends and allies. So it's a big to-do list, but it's important because it's the most serious challenge in our times. And we have to be really serious about this.
I agree
and if we
with
don't
you.
do this stuff, we're going to lose.
I agree with you, Colonel. Let me guess. Is one of those things to say we need to stop funding China's buildup of its military by our investments in China and by our purchases? And I don't mean just corporate purchases or corporate operations, but individuals. But if we have state local governments, for example, that put trillions of dollars of investments, of investing state money like pension money into Chinese investments, that's helping the
Right.
Chinese communist. Is that one of the venues where, say, state and local government go after it?
Absolutely. I mean, on both ends. We have to be serious about growing and strengthening our own economy and stopping doing stupid things like destroying energy independence and the ability of companies to grow and prosper and our economy to grow and prosper and run away federal debt. But on the other side is we have to stop funding China. We should not be pouring American foreign investment into China, particularly in areas that are growing Chinese capabilities, which are a direct threat to us. We shouldn't be doing economic business with China that is putting at risk our own government, our own economy, our own prosperity. And so these are very difficult issues. For example, it's been very, very difficult to get the financial committees in Congress to get serious about looking at sound investments into China for lots of reasons. In part because a lot of people think they're making a lot of money. The Chinese are putting a dump load of money in lobbying, and they want to stop that. But this is the kind of stuff that said we have to do this, because one of the interesting things about this report is in every step we say, this is what you have to do. This is how you have to do it. This is the impact of doing it will have on the competition. And also this is how it affects friends and allies. And so it kind of takes all the things about, well, it's nice to do. Why should I do that? It really takes it off the table. Let me give you a perfect example of a real problem. Banning TikTok. I mean, the evidence of banning TikTok as a national security risk is clear and present. And who is fighting it? One is people that are getting paid by Chinese lobbyists, influenced by Chinese lobbyists, pressured by Chinese lobbyists, and people who say, oh, we can't ban TikTok. We have like 100 million kids on TikTok, and they'll be mad at us and not vote for us. So you're telling me that because it's bad politics for you, it's okay to compromise American national security and the security of all 330 million Americans. I mean, and that kind of nonsense, we argue in the paper, it just simply has to stop.
Well, I've got a way to stop it, Colonel, and let me try this idea on you. The way to get somebody to stop using one product is to offer them a better locally made product. Is in America, which is a technological innovator, incapable of saying, you don't want TikTok, we've got a better one over here? I mean, after all, I'm not that big a fan of Zuckerberg and Facebook, but remember when MySpace was the biggest, greatest, latest thing at the time? And today nobody's ever heard of MySpace, but it sold for billions of dollars, and Facebook took its place. Why can't we do the same thing with TikTok?
Well, I would two things. I would say one is TikTok is a clear and present danger. It is already on millions of devices in the United States, and it was built specifically to compromise the United States. So we can't really sit around and wait to say, go something else.
Fair point.
The other thing is once we ban TikTok, the market will recover in like 13 seconds. The Indians did this. The Indians they had a 5-minute debate. They banned TikTok. The Chinese were all upset and said, you're going to pay a big price for this. Nothing happened. The Indians moved on with their lives. They have all kinds of apps that do this thing. It's not a problem. Once we ban TikTok and move on, you're right. The market will step in and we won't miss it for 5 minutes. You know, there are people that make money on TikTok. There's about 12 of them, right? Okay, those people, those influencers, they'll figure out how to make money on new devices. We don't have to worry about that. We have to worry about the national security of our country and the compromises that the system does. And we have to get serious about it. We can't get serious about TikTok, the most obvious of threats. Then we're not going to tackle the really hard issues.
Well, let me go back to the financial issues for a moment, because, Colonel, this one's bugged me for the last few years. I don't know how many people know this, but if Jim and Lars got together and made a company and then we got it big enough to go on the stock market, they'd say, okay, Jim and Lars, you can have your company on the U.S. stock market, but there are all these financial disclosures you have to make every quarter to everybody who might even think about your stock. And every company in the world that wants to do business in America's financial markets has to comply with that, except for China, which apparently got a buy somehow during Obama. That seems, I mean, so if BMW or any other company from anywhere else on the planet wants to be in our financial markets, they have to comply. China was allowed by Obama and Biden not to comply, and they still aren't. Shouldn't that be an easy one to ban? Say, okay, you can't be in our financial markets unless you want to disclose, which we don't think you're going to want to do.
Okay, that's on the list. And I'll tell you something else that's on the list. You know, China insists on most international organizations in the world and most treaties about being treated as a developing nation. They want all the benefits, the gimmies, and the freebies that developing countries get, even though they're the world's second largest economy. And the United States should not tolerate that. The United States should support not anything in any international organization that treats China as a developing nation. Matter of fact, a bill on our proposal just passed in the House. I think actually everybody voted for it. I mean, these are the things we just have to wake up and smell the coffee and start doing these obvious things that are benefiting China and hurting us. And we just have to stop.
I'm with you. I'm talking to Colonel Jim Carafano, who's an expert in national security at the Heritage Foundation. The report, or as the Colonel points out, is a plan. Winning the new Cold War, a plan for countering China. And it's not just a thumbsucker. It's one where you read it, and here's the plan, and here are the action items you need to take on them. I appreciate that, Colonel, because too much of what comes out of Washington, D.C. or state capitals is all about, let's think about this, and we'll have some big high-concept stuff. I want to see things we can actually do and make a difference. Colonel, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for your service.
Thanks for having me.
You betcha. That's Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano. I'll get back to your phone calls and emails in a bit at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Is artificial intelligence going to take the place of American workers? I almost feel as though we ought to take a couple of different angles on this. And to do that, I've invited Will Reinhardt on, who's Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity. Will, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me again, Lars. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, and I want to invite my listeners as well, because I'll usually get a naysayer or two. But if you want to join the conversation, it's 866-HEY-LARS. Naysayers go first at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. And don't forget to vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find the daily poll question every day from the news of the day at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and at LarsLarson.com on our website. Well, I can't help but think that AI does have the real potential to replace an awful lot of workers, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, doesn't it?
I mean, it could potentially replace workers, but, you know, we're not seeing that yet. And let's be honest, there's been a lot of worries about AI and robotics replacing workers, you know, at least going back at least 10 years now, right? We had Elon Musk not too long ago saying that, you know, that automatic or autonomous vehicles were going to be completely taken over by 2020, which did not happen. So I'm a little bit more skeptical about this. I'm a little bit more skeptical about an AI job apocalypse. And I think what I'm focused on really is trying to understand how this tech is changing businesses and what that really does mean for workers in the near future.
I've actually had some folks I work with say, hey, Lars, you could have an AI talk show host. And that's not a joke. I've heard some news stories that were both written and voiced by artificial intelligence. And they are, if you listen to the voice of a real reporter, my friend Jim Ferretti, and then the AI chat version of it, the voice, the way the story was written and everything else, I could see it happening. But like you, I'm not that concerned about it. And let me throw one older data point into it. Do you remember when the great constitutional scholar Barack Hussein Obama talked about how there was a lot of unemployment in America, and it was because of ATMs, automatic teller machines? And, I heard him say that, and I thought, well, first of all, I think that's ridiculous. And then after that, I happened to run across a study done by a university saying, well, Obama was completely, out of line, like he was on so many things, in that the banks did use a lot of ATMs, but they didn't get rid of a lot of personnel. They just put them to work at jobs that actually require a human being and had them do more high-value work and had the AIs, or the ATMs in that case, do the sort of the low-level drudgery of taking checks and processing them and a lot of other jobs that probably human beings are not all that excited about to begin with. And is there a comparison between that and this concern?
That is, you're spot on. So that's kind of a very very well known paper in this area, in this space. It's about ATMs. There's a guy who's been focused on this very specifically, and what he shows is exactly what you laid out. That when ATMs came in, you actually saw an expansion of bank tellers. You saw more bank tellers because there were more bank retail operations that were opening up, and we see this a lot. That when technology comes in, it changes an industry in ways that are really difficult to predict beforehand, and it shifts some competitors, some people who are a little bit more savvy and are kind of at the top of their game. Typically, they actually reduce the number of workers, while the people who are typically a laggard or aren't as productive in an industry typically will increase the number of their workers. And this happens industry by industry, and it happens in different ways for each different industry. So there's a lot of complexity to this argument, but broadly speaking, technology has brought new productivity to a lot of industries, and it has expanded the options and the choices for people pretty dramatically that are in those industries. So I see this as a benefit, overall. And a lot of the naysayers, I think that there's, future could be different, but I think that the naysayers really, they don't have the high ground, nor do they have the historical context on this one.
I mean, maybe somebody could engineer a Chat GPT naysayer to call me and just argue with me once a day or something like that.
Yes.
No, but I mean, all of this stuff. Will, I had a friend who was a longshoreman years ago, and he ran a crane and he unloaded cargo containers. And I said, how many containers do you unload in an hour? He says 27. I said, what do they weigh? They weigh up to 80,000 pounds. I said, so you're unloading potentially a couple of million pounds of cargo in an hour. And so in 8 hours, he unloads millions and millions of pounds of cargo. I said, how many people, guys with forklifts or with hand trucks or their strong backs would it have taken to have unloaded that back in the day? And the answer is a lot. And you say, so all those people aren't doing that kind of work anymore and breaking their backs and everything else. Yeah, but I think he made $180,000 a year. He was a very well-compensated, union-represented longshoreman who did a very, not a terribly complicated job, but it's a job that requires some skill and it requires attention to the job. You can't drop one of those things on the docks because it would crush people. But having said that, it added a lot of value to what he did in his job.
Yeah, and there's this kind of tandem relationship that you're talking about between new technologies coming in and people adapting to those skills, and then those people leaving and choosing other industries. And we've seen this overall, that this kind of happens. This happens in many industries. And, I know specific studies in nursing show this. There's a lot of folks in healthcare as well. But there are a lot of industries that probably do need to get disrupted. Healthcare is a big one. Education's another big one. We do need disruptive technology to come in and actually make these places much more productive. We need, we need some productivity in these industries to actually help us out and to do better long term.
Well, what would you make then of these researchers at the University of Oxford? Big deals, smart guys and gals. They're saying 9 to 47% of certain jobs might be displaced by a chip.
So what's fun about that is that their original paper, and I actually did a really deep dive onto this study. Their original paper suggested that those jobs should be already gone by now. So it was basically, they suggested that it would be about a 10-year gap, and that was written, right about 10 years ago. It was the end of 2013 that original paper was suggested, or original paper was written. So they suggested that this should have already been happening. And I think that's a really big indicator of the problems that exist here, is that these predictions are really bad, and the predictions about the future are even worse. So I don't really rely on those too much, and I've been focused a lot more on industry by industry changes. And the single biggest one that we've seen is that more automation has occurred, particularly in car manufacturing and a lot of manufacturing spaces. But that's also made manufacturers much more productive, and the people who are working at those manufacturing jobs, it's increased their incomes. So there's a lot that's going on here that I wish that, as your listeners are thinking about it, think about your own industry and how things are changing and how they've happened in the past. And I think that you'll see and understand that there's a lot of complexity, and that's exactly what's happening in every single industry.
Yeah, I can imagine. And maybe it's only the speed at which the change happens, because it seems as though everything is changing, but it's changing at a more rapid rate. And it may be the rapid change that actually ends up displacing people in a way that you can't accommodate, like saying, okay, let's let the older workers, as they retire, we'll replace them this way, and we'll make the change comfortable, except there are probably some political forces that are going to push the other direction on that. That's Will Reinhart. Will, thanks very much. Will is a senior research fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity. Glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls and emails, which we'll do in just a moment. David Spica joins me now, who's president of Guidestone Funds, which recently launched the largest pro-life impact fund listed on the NASDAQ. And David's at a baseball game right now, so we're hoping nobody hits a home run in the middle of the interview. David, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to talk to you, Lars.
Nice to talk to you as well. I want to ask you about this because I've always told my audience, I don't think ESG forced on people, either through, these big funds going after state pension investments and all that, where it's largely out of sight of the people who are most directly financially affected, taxpayers. I don't think it's right at all. On the other hand, I've always said that if you want to invest your money and you tell your investment fund, hey, I don't want to be in alcohol, or I don't want to be in tobacco, I don't want to be in firearms, or whatever it is you don't want to be, oil, go ahead. This is something where you're taking ESG, except it's really not ESG. It's individual investors saying, I'd like to be invested in things that actually preserve life on planet Earth instead of trying to destroy the economy the way the broader ESG argument is.
Yeah, that's right. We live in the United States of America, the land of the free, and we like freedom. And so as believers, we want to be free to invest in the things that support our values. And things that support our values are pro-life, things that are supportive of life from conception to death. And we want to help people around the world. We want to do the things that Jesus taught us to do, to provide for the needy. And that's what this fund does. It invests in entities that do those things, but also invest in energy companies and companies that are producing energy that is a needed commodity around the world to raise standards of living.
Yeah, because in this modern world, you can't be very pro-life if you're not in favor of producing the energy it takes to run our society, whether it's a first world society or even third world societies, right?
That's exactly right. One of the companies we invest in, and this isn't specifically an energy company, but we invest in a company that is the largest provider of internet and wireless services in Africa and the Middle East. Now you think, okay, how is that an impact company? Well, how do people get by these days without a cell phone? How do they get by without access to the internet? They don't. And even people in third world countries need access to the internet. And so we want to provide that. Energy, obviously, is a great example. How do you create a business? How do you support a lifestyle without having access to energy? So these are the type of investments that we're making that the ESG folks aren't really paying attention to because they're so focused on the thing of the day, and that's climate change, and that's their focus today. We're truly focused on helping people around the world live a life of meaning.
Well, and in fact, even if you're talking about desperately poor countries that occasionally have mineral resources, you may preserve a lot of lives if you say, well, let's invest in a company that's capable of going in there and getting the oil out or the minerals out or whatever it is, because we're going to make lots and lots of jobs with income, even though from our perspective, we want it because maybe we want the oil or we want the cobalt or we want whatever. But if you're investing in the right way, you can benefit people in both circumstances, first world and third world, can't you?
Absolutely. When you think about people that go out on mission and mission organizations, one of the key things they're doing is providing economic opportunity for peoples in third world countries that don't have economic opportunity. They're barely getting by. And so to the extent we can provide investment in any sort of industry, whether it's mining or energy production or whatever the case may be, yes, we are providing jobs for those people. And again, we're investing with companies that do it the right way. We're not investing in companies that use child labor or that take advantage of people. We're investing in companies that do it the right way, that are honorable organizations, that are truly interested in the betterment of the communities they serve.
All right. Now, are you getting pushback from the folks with ESG? Because it would seem in some cases you're offering your clients the very thing that they're telling their clients to get away from.
Not so much, Lars. I'll tell you, the funds are relatively new. We actually launched the original fund 2 years ago and then split it up into two different funds, an equity and a fixed income fund, just within the last couple of months. So we don't have a real long track record. So It's not that well known. But our market is primarily evangelical Christians and people that are just tired of what's going on in society these days. They think society is throwing at us and sticking in our face. So I've got a feeling as we get larger, we may get some pushback. But for now, there's just a lot of folks that are very happy to be able to invest in a fund that is investing according to their values. It's giving them the opportunity to invest in the things that they believe in, that are spreading the gospel, that are promoting the sanctity of life, that are helping people around the world and aren't focused on climate change and things that aren't really of substance.
I'm talking to David Spica, who's president of Guidestone Funds. That's one word, Guidestone Funds, which was recently launched, the largest pro-life impact fund listed on the NASDAQ. David, you've answered, my audience would tell you, they get tired of me saying this, but I keep waiting for the marketplace to solve this. If all the ESG people are saying, we're going to get you out of conventional energy like oil, natural gas, and all those things, which are good investments, I keep wondering who's going to step forward and say, well, if they're going to give up on all that stuff, we're going to jump into it with both feet. And that way, the ESG folks can go one direction, but you can take people another direction and probably with larger returns.
Absolutely. The thing to keep in mind, one of the things we've been going through, right, with inflation has been high energy prices. The promotion of climate change agenda and clean energy is just going to promote even higher prices for oil and natural gas and coal and things of that nature. So we are providing the capital that these companies need to invest in production to help mitigate that rise in prices. And we all know that longer term, green energy is not the solution. Wind and solar and water, we cannot run the world's economies on wind, solar, and water. We need carbon fuels. And natural gas is a great solution. It's a clean energy, and it's something that's a great solution. And companies need capital to be able to produce natural gas. And so if natural gas prices stay high and we're providing that capital, that means a great return on that investment for our shareholders.
Absolutely right. David Spica. David, thank you very much. I appreciate the time. That's David Spica, who is the president of Guidestone Funds, which recently launched the largest pro-life impact fund listed on the NASDAQ. I'm glad to give you a little bit of advice of my own. Are you a small business owner who could use a few $100,000? Employee retention tax credits, they're incredibly an opportunity for you and your business. Call the experts at getmyfunds.com. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic. They've already helped out 1,500 businesses, and those owners have received about $300 million in funding. And they know what they're doing. They've got a team of CPAs who specialize in filing those tax credits. They're with you every step of the game. Believe me, even if there's an audit, they stand behind their work with an audit safeguard. If you retain W-2 employees during COVID, or even if you already got the PPP, you need to call Get My Funds now at 800-535-2950. It's not a grant, it's not a loan, it's a tax refund. And there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with a team you can trust. GetMyFunds.com at 800-535-2950 or GetMyFunds.com. That's GetMyFunds.com.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to tell you something. If you were to listen to this show, you might gather the impression that I hate the idea of electric cars. I do not. I think all kinds of technology is important, and brand new technology usually has some bugs to be worked out. But I'll be happy with electric vehicles when they do two things. One, when they make economic sense, and they don't right now, by my view. And number two, when I'm convinced that America can actually generate the electric power that is necessary to keep them recharged. Those two things would go a long way. So when I got the opportunity to put James Bell on, who's Director of Corporate Communications for Kia America, I said yes in a hurry. James, welcome to the program. How are you?
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
So let me ask you this. Let's start with this. You say that electric vehicles are becoming more popular. Are they, and would they be popular at all but for the government subsidies and the push from the government that everybody has to buy them in the next 10 or 15 years?
Well, I disagree with the statement of that everybody has to buy them. Gasoline vehicles, gas stations, mechanics that work on them will be around for decades. We're just in the middle of a really fascinating and fantastic transition time, not unlike, I would say, what must have been experienced between the horse-drawn carriage and early gasoline. And so I do believe that they're popular and gaining in popularity based on people's experience with them. There is a luxury to not going to the gas station, especially if you come home late one night and say, oh, I've got an early morning tomorrow. Let me get gas in the morning, and then, as we all do, we run late the next day and jump in the car and say, oh, heck, now I have to go to the gas station. That situation is washed away. So there's a luxury to it, and as more and more people experience electric personal transportation, they're telling their experiences, and so it's kind of a groundswell as well.
Well, James, you say we're going to have filling stations and oil and gas-powered cars for decades. I agree with you. But you may be familiar with a guy, Joe Biden. Joe Biden says we're only going to need oil for the next 10 years. He said that less than a month ago. And so apparently from his point of view, and right now he's president of the United States, and from the point of view of the states where they've said we're going to mandate the end of gasoline-powered vehicles in many states by 2035, they seem to think they're going to get rid of the gas-powered, diesel-powered cars fairly quickly, and that will effectively force people to buy them.
Well, that's not entirely true. What has been said in countries all across the world, including several states here in the U.S., is that gasoline-powered vehicles will no longer be allowed to be sold. They're not going to be taken away. They're not going to, disappear. It's just that we're starting this transitional period. Again, I can't help but equate it to the transition from horse-drawn carriage to gasoline. We still have horses. They're just used for different reasons. And I think that's what's going to happen in this case. People will use electric vehicles for running around town, picking kids up at school, commute to jobs, the little daily things where when using gasoline-powered car is not as efficient. But then, a long trip to grandma's house, throwing things in the back and going on camping trips, things of that nature will still be probably used or will still probably use gasoline-powered for that. So I do see it a little bit differently. I see it as more of a transitional than a deadline.
Okay, but let me ask you about this, James. Do they make economic sense today? When the average electric vehicle, last year it was $20,000 difference to a comparable gasoline or diesel car. This year they've cut the difference to $10,000. but 10,000 bucks for the average. And in the case of the higher end vehicles, the ones that'll go farther and all that, the difference is even bigger than that. The difference between a base model F-150 gas pickup truck from Ford and an electric, the Lightning, is 20,000 bucks. That's enough to buy the gas to drive you around planet Earth 4 times if we had a highway to do it. Do they make economic sense?
I believe we're getting into that phase, yes. I mean, I can't speak for my friends at Ford, but I can tell you here at Kia, our least expensive EV is in the low 40s. Not, maybe within $7,000 or $8,000 of an equivalent gasoline-powered car. But then from that, you're getting, darn close to 300 miles of range on a charge. And again, it's the luxury of no longer being tethered to the gasoline station process, to being able to charge at home. The other part about it that I think people really are starting to catch on to, excuse me, is the luxury of the driving experience itself. It's quiet, it's smooth, it's powerful. It's just a nice place to be, and it relieves a lot of daily pressure. And I think we're all probably looking for that at some level.
Well, let me ask you about some of the other advantages of an electric car. How do the insurance premiums compare? Because I've been told that electric vehicle premiums for insurance, which everybody has to have, are 27% higher than for gas-powered vehicles. That's an industry number. That doesn't sound like a fun experience.
Well, I can't speak to that. Again, I'm on the manufacturing side of this, but it kind of confuses me. It may have been that way at the start as the technology was maybe a little bit harder, from a supply chain, just not as common as, say, a carburetor or, the things that go into gasoline-powered cars. But I think that that is going to change. As far as the maintenance and the reliability and the usability of electric vehicles, insurance companies would be very pleased with that, because putting them back together in an accident is much less complexity. Average gasoline-powered car has about 20,000 parts, and an electric car has about 4,000. So there's much less there that needs to be replaced.
Except I've been told that in some accidents, they say, well, you've got damage to the battery. You can't fix part of the battery. You may have to junk the whole car after an accident. Is that not true?
Again, well, I can't speak for an accident and the dynamics of that, but, all the manufacturers are building the battery system as an integral portion and part of the actual structure of the vehicle. So the same thing with the gasoline-powered car. If the accident is catastrophic enough and the frame can't be put back together, or the engine is damaged beyond repair, these things happen. But again, I think the real point of the story here is to identify that this is a transitional time. We're moving towards this. The proverbial switch has been flipped, and those that are embracing and trying electric vehicles, again, for their daily commutes, for just daily life, as opposed to long journeys at this time, until such time that we have more charging infrastructure and being able to charge at home. The man in the street who's living with those vehicles is having a very good experience.
Last quick question, James, because we're up to a break. Who should pay for that charging infrastructure? Because the government didn't subsidize gas stations, but now they're telling all of us that we all have to pay for the electric charging stations. Should the taxpayers pay for it, or the people who choose electric cars?
Well, I'm not sure where you're getting that information, because as at this point, it's really kind of a combination of the manufacturers themselves partnering with independent agencies and businesses.
James Bell is the head of corporate communications for Kia. Mr. Bell, it's a pleasure to have you on. You've got the Lars Larson Show.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad to get to your phone calls and emails. I want to talk about whether or not, if we get to a majority of people, as Canada is already at a minority, a sizable minority, about 27% of Canadians strongly agree that euthanasia is acceptable for the suffering caused by poverty. And 28% strongly or moderately agree that killing by doctors is acceptable for suffering caused by the homeless. Wesley Smith joins me now, who's an author and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. Wesley, does this one bring to mind that essay by, I think it was wasn't it John Donne who wrote A Modest Proposal? and that we're really kind of going down that road, aren't we? Welcome back, by the way.
Thanks for having me on again, Lars. Always good to talk with you. I think with this, this isn't satire, unfortunately.
And that
As
was.
I recall, John Donne, the satire was about eating the poor. But this isn't satire. Canada legalized euthanasia in about 2015. And since then, it has been, it's jumped off the euthanasia cliff, if you will, to continually expand who is eligible. And I think when you do that as a society, and the society comes to a consensus that killing is an acceptable answer to suffering, at that point, the suffering that justifies killing just begins to expand and expand. And what's really alarming, and I've got some other stats here for you from this polling, is Canada is our closest cultural cousin.
Yep.
You know, I used to talk about in the Netherlands, they actually conjoin euthanasia with organ harvesting, and even of people with mental illnesses. And the advocates for assisted suicide would say, oh, well, that's the Netherlands. That's nothing like America. Well, Canada's a lot like America. And by the way, Canada also conjoins euthanasia with organ harvesting. But listen to these stats. As you said, 27% either strongly or moderately agree that poverty is grounds for euthanasia. That's a lethal jab. 28% strongly or moderately agree homelessness. 51% inability to find medical treatment. So the answer, you can't get good care, so the answer is for the doctors who aren't caring for you to kill you. 43% for mental illness.
And by the way, Wes, let me throw into that. And this has been quite a few years, but there was a woman, we talked to her on the show. She's died now, but at the time she had cancer and she needed treatment. And the treatment was moderately expensive, and it would only buy her another 2 years of life. But hey, 2 years of life? How about 2 minutes? And the state, which had control of the medical plan she was on, it was Medicaid, said, well, we're not going to spend the $6,000 to keep you alive for another couple of years, but we invite you to contact us about getting the pills to commit doctor-assisted suicide. And that literally happened. We've got a copy of the letter. I've talked to the woman. It was ugly, but it basically said, you're too expensive to keep alive, but we'll spend a couple of $100s to help you kill yourself. So this is an idea.
Was in Oregon.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, that was in Oregon. I wrote about that case quite a bit. And because there was some stink about that, so some of the rationing in the Medicaid program of Oregon was shifted. But you're absolutely right. She received a letter from an administrator of the Medicaid law in Oregon saying, well, we won't pay for your continued treatment for, I think it was breast cancer, but we will pay for your assisted suicide. And you see that also happening all the time in Oregon, where they call it medical assistance in dying, MAID. They always have euphemisms. It's a lethal jab. And 50% say that euthanasia should be available for people with disabilities, which it is, by the way, now in Canada. So, and by the way, next year, mental illness will be eligible for euthanasia in Canada. So once a society opens this door, it doesn't just stay where, you know, the advocates say, well, we're going to have strict guidelines that'll protect against abuse. It's just for the few who can't do, when nothing else can be done to alleviate suffering. That's a lie. It's never been true. And in this country, while we haven't certainly gone as far yet as Canada, if we continue to legalize assisted suicide, the grounds for killing will continually expand. And it already is happening in our states. Hawaii, Colorado, Washington, Oregon have expanded eligibility. Vermont now says you don't have to be a resident, and they permit assisted suicide by telemedicine so that the doctor who prescribes lethally may never even meet the patient. So you can see that there's a cultural imperialism going on here and a desire to spread this death agenda entirely across the United States.
I'm talking to Wesley Smith. He's a writer and a great writer. We've been, as he said, he's been on the show for decades, but he's with the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. I assume it wasn't the Discovery Center that did the poll. Did the people who do the poll ask those questions because those are policies they seem to want to actually push?
From what I can see, I've read the polling, but from what I can see, they did some polling about are the people of Canada satisfied with the way things are now, and majorities were. And then they were talking in the poll to see what attitudes would be to expand what's currently permitted. And that's where they got into the issue of poverty and homelessness. And by the way, there have already been euthanasia cases documented where the person who asked to be killed said, if I could get better housing, I wouldn't want to die, while they were euthanized anyway. Or if I could get independent living services, I wouldn't want to die. You've had the veterans, social service people, the VA, what we would call the VA in the United States. I don't know what it's called in Canada. But veterans with PTSD denied services and offered euthanasia. So this is what happens when killing becomes the acceptable answer. Pretty soon that becomes, and it's a lot cheaper and it's a lot easier in the sense of there's not a lot of time and effort that goes into it. And if you think that killing is not wrong, that becomes the slouch to go-to remedy when things get tough.
Although I suspect that the same people who back this stuff, killing because you're homeless, killing because you got mental illness that can't be addressed, killing because you can't get good medical care, are the same people who oppose killing, say, serial killers under capital punishment. And by the way, I know I'm going to get a lot of email. It was Jonathan Swift, not John Dunn. A modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people from being a burden to their parents or country and from making them beneficial to the public, commonly referred to as a modest proposal, where he proposed to ease poverty among the Irish by having them sell their newborn babies as food. And it was a satire, as you point out, Wesley, but that was satire. This stuff is real. What do we need to do to stop this? And the people behind it who apparently believe, well, if you're crazy, we'll kill you. Because I still remember there was a guy in the 40s in Germany who did the same kind of thing with disabled people.
When a society, but that was the doctors doing it. He didn't require anybody to do that, and that was a result of the eugenics movement that led to the euthanasia killing of people with disabilities. In fact, the doctors in Germany called it a healing treatment. They thought they were alleviating suffering. And early in that thing, Jewish people were not allowed to participate because they were considered Untermenschen, as you know. But what happens is when a society legalizes something, that is the same thing as saying this is right, this is good. And a lot of people take their morality now from whether something is legal or not. Obviously, you and I understand that if something is legal doesn't make it moral and doesn't make it right.
Nope.
But when you legalize killing in these specific circumstances, it's not surprising that people get the message that suffering is the worst thing possible, so bad that even killing is justified to alleviate it.
No, it doesn't make any sense at all. Wesley Smith writes for the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. Wes, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you very much.
I always appreciate it, Lars. Thank you.
Glad to do it. Glad you're listening on the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to take your phone calls and emails. And as you know, we put naysayers right to the head of the line at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. You can send emails to talk@larslarson.com. Doesn't get much easier than that. And you can vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find it two places, at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and larslarson.com on the web. And you're listening to the Lars Larson Show.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. If I have to admit, as I've made my rule to admit, anytime I have a dog in the fight, I am a Protestant Christian. And so I've enjoyed the friendship of a guy by the name of Professor T.B. Thornton. I know him as Tracy. And he joins me now, a Christian theologian and the author of a new book called Giants in the Earth, the Methuselah Chronicles, Book 1. Tracy, it's good to have you on the program. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Lars. It's quite an honor to be on with you.
Well, listen, I just wanted you to tell people, because I've read one of your two books. The second one I have not had a chance to read yet. But you decided, as a man with a theologian's background, but also as a day job, which you worked for quite a time, as a butcher. So this isn't a guy who just sat in the hallowed halls of, the Ivy League somewhere or sat on a college campus. He actually knows how to work for a living. But then you said, I think I can write some books that actually help amplify Christianity by putting it into fictional, not the book into fictional form, not the Bible, but to tell other stories that are associated with it. And I wanted you to describe that for me.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll tell you, I was a working man for quite a while. I worked as a butcher for more than 30 years, and but I'm also a guy who likes fiction, so I decided I'd write something that wasn't redone like most everything is, and I wanted to depict biblical heroes. Now, these heroes in this book happen to be people we know about, but we don't know much about. But I wanted to depict biblical heroes that, while flawed, were men and women of faith who lived their faith as if God were literally right beside them. So, and that's kind of the thrust of my writing style, I guess you could say.
Well, and I think that's important because right now, if there's anything that's troubling a lot of us, it's how in the world did America become the kind of country it is today? And many people, including me, go to the idea that, well, it's because the country has kind of abandoned its faith base, and it had a strong faith base. In fact, I had a conversation with a family member last night, and the family member said, well, America's not just a Christian nation. I said, no, we're not a theocracy. But our founders were Christians, and what they wrote was they wrote a document called the Constitution, said you don't have to be of any faith. The government is forbidden to force you to follow a certain faith. In fact, you can be of no faith whatsoever, and you can still hold public office. You can be a citizen. These were Christians, but they were pluralistic Christians who said, you know, we want a country where people of all faiths, or even people, sadly, of no faith, are welcome, can run for office, and prosper. So it's a country that I think benefited a lot from its Christian roots. I can't really imagine our friends, the Muslims, writing a constitution that was as friendly to all the other faiths. But that's a subject for another day. But that's what you're getting at is this country needs some kind of faith base, and we've walked away from it. I say we as a country. I haven't, you haven't. But a lot of the country has simply walked away from it and forgotten all the blessings we got.
That's true. And it is kind of sad. It's not only that we've walked away, we've denied the power of faith. And the problem is, too, is this, I don't know, this nebulous idea of what faith is. Because, you know, you hear a lot of things, you got to have faith, you got to have, you know, but the problem is, what is that faith, and does it have legs when trouble comes? Now, as a person who's gone through some pretty major health issues, I had to find that out pretty quick. I was told at one point I had a brain tumor, basically, and I had to find out if my faith had legs. And thankfully, and through the Lord's help, I found that out. But we have forgotten where we came from, and we've denied where we've come from. And we've left God out of the picture. I mean, geez, even at Christmas, we leave Jesus out of the Christmas party. So that's kind of where we are as a nation right now. It's worrisome.
Well, maybe books like Giants in the Earth and Methuselah Chronicles, Book 1, which is Professor T.B. Thornton's latest book, and I encourage you to take a look at it and his other books as well. But Professor, I got to ask you about this. See, I think I would have been much more enthralled with Sunday school back when I was a kid if they'd said, by the way, there were giants and there were unicorns and there were a lot of other things, except it was never really put that way. You've actually said, I'm going to create some stories that are true to the book, but they still expand upon this by using some of the same heroes from the book without departing from the overall message. How did you do that?
Well, I'll tell you, I was raised in a way to take things quite literally in the Bible, and I know that's scoffed at nowadays. But the fact is, I truly believe, and Genesis 6:4 says that in those days there were giants in the earth, and the sons of God, meaning the fallen angels, in my theory, came in unto those daughters and were born to them giants. Actual giants. And if you do the word study really deeply, you find that means giant men. And I take it literally, and I write a story about it. And in the book, there's a lot of really cool things in there. Kids love it. Adults love it. But it's got giants. It's got angels and fallen angels. It's got some dinosaurs, which according to Job, he describes in Job 41 and 40. the behemoth and the leviathan. And so I include those things in there, and it kind of grabs the imagination of the kids. There's a reason we have all these stories of fire-breathing dragons. Read Job 41. You'll see where they come from. So
they've got kind of a faith base. And you did aim it to some extent at younger adults, didn't you? Or am I wrong in that?
You know what? That's the funny thing is when I started writing it, I wanted to write something that I would want to see. I mean, I honestly, I got a little sick of seeing the same old Batman, Superman regurgitations, and I wanted to write something with real heroes, with real people, and it ended up that kids love it, but adults love it too. It seemed, because it's a fantasy type thing, a lot of people believe that it was written for kids, which you know what? I tried to write it for everybody. I got
to tell you though, Tracy, there are plenty of adults friends that I know who play Dungeons and Dragons, or they play other games that are based on fantasy stories because they find them entertaining. And believe me, if you didn't believe in fantasy stories, you wouldn't have had a lot of people enjoying the Lord of the Rings series, either in books or on movies. Where do you plan to go next with this storytelling, and how do you make sure you stay true to the original so you don't depart too far from chapter and verse?
Well, in all, this series is going to have 7 installments. Book 1, Giants in the Earth, is the first. It's kind of an introduction to the characters, and there's a really good storyline there. And some really cool stuff happens. It's a little brutal in spots, but everything is anymore. And Book 2 carries that on with a lot of the same characters, but some new ones too. And the whole idea is it's the Methuselah Chronicles. Now, Methuselah was the oldest man ever to live. According to the Bible, he lived to be 969 years. So I'm carrying it through. Book 1 starts when he's 16. Book 2, 8 years later. Now, Book 3 I'm writing, that's 8 years later. But I'm going to jump forward, and by the end, it's going to end with Methuselah's death, which also happens to be exactly when the Bible says the flood came.
Yep.
So
and you may have to write a flood story as well. There are endless spin-offs I can imagine. That is Professor T.B. Thornton. I know him as Tracy Thornton, Christian theologian, former butcher, and author of the new book called Giants in the Earth, The Methuselah Chronicles. Tracy, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Are the politicians who are yelling the loudest about climate change the same ones that are doing the least about the problem, if you believe that climate change is the kind of problem it's been made out to be? I mean, after all, you've got the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who said, almost 4 years ago, that the Earth was going to come to an end within 12 years. Well, I guess that takes care of my visa, paying off my Visa card, doesn't it? Because the fact is, I don't have to worry about any of that. The whole world's coming to an end, according to the doomsayers of the climate change crap. This segment of the show is brought to you by nickshivers.com. For an instant offer to sell your home immediately, go to nickshivers.com for details. Now, my friend Todd Myers joins us now, amateur beekeeper and environmental director with the Washington Policy Center. Todd, good to have you on the day before Earth Day.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And given what I know about climate science, I would recommend that you pay your Visa bill.
I'll pay my Visa bill because I think the Earth is going to continue on. I think AOC is out to lunch in a lot of ways. But let me ask you about this. Tomorrow's Earth Day. It's also happens to be Lenin's birthday, which I think there's a tie-in there, but maybe that's a subject for another day. But let's talk about the politicians who say we're going to save the planet from sure ruin because of climate change, but are they actually getting anything done about what they say is the problem? I don't even accept that CO2 is a pollutant or a problem, but let's assume that they're right about that. Are they actually doing something about the problem that they talk so much about?
Well, I think there's two things to that. The first question is, are the policies that they adopt working? And the answer often is no. The state has only released CO2 data for Washington State through 2019, but every year that Governor Inslee has been in office, CO2 emissions have gone up, despite the fact that he promised literally every year that they would go down. and actually announced he was running for president in 2019 based on what he claimed was his record of success in fighting climate change and reducing CO2 emissions. The second one, which I think you hinted at, which is, are the people who yell the loudest doing the most? And we actually find that a University of Michigan research found the opposite. The more people think that it's government's job to address climate change, the less they do personally. And ironically, it is conservatives who do the most for the environment in terms of recycling and doing other things like that. Not just because it's good for the planet, but because it's good financially. Nobody wants to waste money on too much gas, too much electricity. People want to reuse things because it saves them money. And that personal responsibility, that approach, which is consistent with conservative values, turns out to be the best way to help the planet.
I'd even add to that, Todd, that even the supposedly evil corporations, I don't happen to believe that they are evil, but even the evil corporations, if a corporation could cut its electric bill by 10%, and it made financial sense to do it, they'd do it. If a company that transports oil, for example, or anything else on train cars could avoid more wrecks or more pollution or more spills, they do it because spills are expensive and derailed trains are expensive. In other words, all the things they might do that would actually cut down on energy use, cut down on pollution, cut down on lawsuits, those are all good for business.
And we don't have to speculate that theoretically. We know that that is true. In fact, the biggest reduction in air pollution in the United States occurred from the late 1940s, early 1950s to the early 1970s. The real strict Clean Air Act, which we all think about, was passed in the early 70s. But in the 2 decades prior to that, we saw a big reduction in air pollution because air pollution consists a lot of, particulate matter, which is little bits of coal and other things like that were lost. It was essentially waste. And as companies became more efficient, they were able to reduce the waste and reduce air pollution. Now, it didn't solve the problem entirely, but it made a huge impact without the government having to look over their shoulder because they had the incentives that you're talking about.
I'm talking to Todd Myers, who's environmental director of the Washington Policy Center. The other thing you mentioned, and I had not thought about this in a while, the Prius, as you point out, was not subsidized or promoted by the government until after a private company created it, and they did it because it was good for business, right?
That's exactly right. And so people think that, government is the leader on improving environmental technology. But in fact, what we see more often is that innovation comes from the free market, and then politicians jump on the bandwagon and then take credit for what other people have done. It's sort of the reverse of Barack Obama's old, "You didn't build that." Well, government didn't build that. Toyota saw an opportunity to sell vehicles to people who were environmentally conscious, wanted to use less gas. And then California, which had a law mandating electric vehicles in the 1990s that didn't exist, finally were forced to accept hybrids like the Prius as an alternative because it did exist. Government didn't even know, politicians didn't know what a hybrid was until Toyota created it. And so I think it's ironic that what was the sort of the symbol of environmentalism, the Prius, came out of the free market, not government.
Well, and one thing, I recall reading a piece about a decade after the Prius came onto the market, and I think it was actually Jeff Bezos' liberal paper, the Washington Post, that did it, and they said, they've been making them and selling them for 10 years, and they've lost money on them for a solid 10 years. So the company was doing it not even necessarily because there was consumer demand, but because they thought, well, we want to look good, so we're going to make the Prius. And they sold, how many companies would make a product as expensive as an automobile and then sell it at a loss for a decade?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and they didn't make a lot of money on it, but it also helped them improve their technology, and it made Toyota recognized for even people who didn't want to buy a Prius as a technology leader. So, businesses, I tend not to second guess businesses that I'm not in because they know what they're doing. And I do worry that they, are trying to look good rather than do good. But once again, we see the real innovation is coming out of the free market. And it's why I think conservatives should embrace Earth Day and not see it. The left wants to see Earth Day through a political lens. Conservatives live Earth Day basically every day because they are the farmers, the hikers, the hunters, things like that. And so we need to get the politics out of Earth Day to say good environmental stewardship is conservative, and we know how to do it right, not the political phony way of the left.
Couldn't agree with you more. I got to tell you one little story. About a number of years ago, I was talking to a guy at a Lexus dealership. Didn't end up buying the car, but I said, you guys probably have a hybrid. And he said, oh, yeah, we do. I said, he said, do you want to see one? I said, I'm not interested. He goes, yeah, they're not selling very well. I said, you're making a Lexus and it doesn't sell very well? And they said, yeah, it's because people come in and they say, but you can't tell that it's a hybrid. In other words, the folks buying the Prius were buying it because then everybody around them knew that person is saving the planet. And if you went and bought the same kind of hybrid, I mean, with the same kind of mileage advantages and all that, but nobody can tell all the good things I'm doing. So they said, yeah, I'll buy it when you put a big label on it that makes it clear I'm driving a hybrid. Todd Myers from the Washington Policy Center. Always glad that you listen to the Lars Larson Show.